Hi and welcome back to my channel. If you're seeing my face for the first time, my name is Phoebe, and if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, please hit the subscribe button. Today's video tutorial will be on this three-part corset top with puff sleeve. So this video promises to be very detailed. So here are the measurements that I'll be working with, and I'll be using the bodice method for the drafting process. So if you don't know how to draft a basic bodice pattern using the bodice method, please check the link in the description box. So the first thing I'll be doing here is to create the starting point for all my measurements. So I marked 1 inch from the edge of my pattern paper. So this line here becomes my shoulder line. So my shoulder to bust line is 9 inches, while my shoulder to waistline for the front is 17 inches. Now for my top length, I just took my hip line, which is 10 inches away from my waistline, so making it a total of 27. So on this line right here, I marked half of my shoulder measurement, which is 8, and I went downwards by 1 inch to create my shoulder slant. Then my bust line from here would be 8 inches. So I just went to the center of my paper and I just remarked everything on the other side so that I can get an even line. So the next thing is to just extend all the points together like this. So the pattern I'll be drafting first is for the front. So here's my bust line, this is my waistline, and this is my top line. So what I did next was to mark half of my shoulder measurement on my bust line, and I would extend that point to my shoulder slant like so. The next thing I did was to mark my neck width of 3 inches and my neck depth of 3 inches, and I created a curve for my neckline, and I went ahead to create my shoulder slant line. So after doing that, from my shoulder line, here's my shoulder line, I came downwards by 6 inches. This is how low I want my corset cups to be, so yours can be higher or lower. After doing that, on my waistline, I marked half of my bust pan measurement plus half an inch, making it a total of 4.25 inches. And I did the same thing right there at my top line. The next thing I did was to mark my shoulder to under bust measurements and then my shoulder to my bust point line. And I went ahead to extend the lines like this. So here's my under bust line. This is my bust point line. So now on my under bust line, I also went ahead to mark half of my bust pan measurement plus half an inch, and I repeated the same thing right there at my bust point line. On this line right here, I also marked half of my bust pan measurement plus half an inch, and I went ahead to just connect all the points together in a straight line. On my waistline, I'll be taking a dart of 1.5 inches, so that will be 0.75 inch on both sides of the line. On my underbust, I took a dart of 2 inches, so that was 1 inch on both sides of the line. Then on this point here, I would be contouring that area, so I also took a dart of 2 inches, and that was 1 inch on both sides of the line. Now from my bust point line, I came downwards by 0.75 inch. After that, I came upwards from my top line by 2 inches. So the next thing I did was to just connect all the points together like this. When I get to this point, I just use the curved part of my ruler to connect from my underbust to that point below my bust point line, and I repeated the same thing on the other side. The next thing I did was to place my ruler this way and made a connection from this point here down to that point below my bust point line. So after doing the first side, I repeated the same thing on the other side. What I did next was to measure what I had from the center of my paper down to that line right there on my bust line. So I had 4 inches. I placed the 4 inches on the second line right there and went ahead to mark a quarter of my bust circumference plus 1 inch for my side seam allowance. So in total I had about 10.5 inches. So on my waistline I measured what I had down to the first dot line. So I had 3.75 inches, placed it on the second dot line, and I went ahead to measure to mark a quarter of my waist circumference plus my side seam allowance of 1 inch. Then on my top line, which happens to also be my hip line, I don't have any dots right there. So I will just go ahead and mark a quarter of my hip circumference, 10.5, plus 1 inch for my side seam allowance, 11.5. So the next thing is to just connect all the side seam allowances together. On this line right here, remember that I had my shoulder measurement, half of my shoulder measurement, which is 8 inches. So to contour that area, I will be taking away 2 inches from my shoulder measurement. That will be 6 inches. So from here, I measured what I had to my first dot line. So I moved what I had to the second dot line. You can see that I have the 6 inches that I need. So the next thing I did was to just create my armhole curve this way. So to get the neckline, I came downwards by 1.5 inches from this point and connected or created a sweetheart shape like this. Then from this point here, I came inwards by a 0.5 inch, which will be the space between the two corset cups. Then from my underbust, I placed my ruler this way and connected from my underbust to this point right here. Then I just extended the point like this to the center front. So the next thing I did was to create the second cup. So I placed my ruler this way and connected from here to my armhole area. So the next thing I'll be doing is to create my bust darts. So from my bust point line, I went inwards by 1 inch, and here I took my bust dart of 1 inch, which is the difference between my front waistline and my back waistline. So I would make an extension for the closing of my bust dart here and then reconnect that point back into my side seam. So to create the first part of the corset cups, from here I decided to come downwards by 3.5 inches. So I did the same thing at this point. Then from my armhole area I came downwards by 2.5 inches. From here I came downwards by 2.5 inches. What I did next was to just connect the points that I marked together. So I just created a little bit of curve. So the curve wasn't so much, it was just a little curve. So I just went back in to make the line a little bit bolder. So the next thing I'll be doing is to cut open this line that I have right here all the way to this point so I can close my bust darts. So to ease the closing of the darts, I'll be cutting out my pattern from the rest of the pattern paper, and I'll go ahead and close my darts like this. And to keep the dart in place, I have my masking tape right here. After closing the bust dart, I continue to cut out my pattern like this. Then I cut through this dart all the way to this point right here. So I stopped at this point and I repeated the same thing on the other side and stopped at this point here. So I went ahead to close this dart that I created right here. So the next thing I did was to use my masking tape to seal the dart. And I would continue to cut out the rest of the pattern like this. So the reason why I closed that dart was because of the contouring. Remember, it needs to be fitted across the chest area. So the next thing is to just cut out the rest of my pattern like this. So the next thing I did was to just cut through this curve that I have right here on the cups and also cut through my side seam. After cutting everything out, I would be holding this place with my masking tape so that the dart stays in place. This will be the first part. This is the second part, while this is the third part. So I'll be adding half an inch seam allowance to these areas. So I used an arrow sign to indicate the areas that I'll be adding half an inch seam allowance. I have already added my side seam allowance of 1 inch. So I will just add half an inch to the hemline of the top. And then to this area, I would add half an inch. So this is the center. So that place will be cut on a fold. And I would add half an inch to the upper part and to this cup area. So guys, the front pattern is ready and we have the 3 parts of the corset cups right there. So the next thing I'll be doing is to move on to the back pattern. For the back, I have gone ahead to mark out the lines. So right here, I have my shoulder line. And this is my zipper allowance of 1 inch. So I have my bust line, which is 9 inches from my shoulder line. My waistline for the back is 16, while that of my front was 17 inches. So the difference was 1 inch. Then I have my top line at 26 inches, which is 10 inches away from the waistline of the back. So moving on, what I'll be doing is to mark 6 inches below my shoulder line, which was the same thing I did for the front. So 6 inches below that point. Then the next thing I'll be doing is to mark half of my bust part measurement plus half an inch right there on my waistline. And I repeated the same thing right there at my top line. And because this is the back, I went upwards by 1 inch from my top line. And then connected from my top line all the way to my waistline like this. Also on my bust line, I marked half of my bust part measurement plus half an inch and came downwards by 1 inch. Then from here, I would take a dart of half an inch on both sides. That will be a total of 1 inch. Then extended the line like this and went ahead to create the dart shape from my waistline to that 1 inch below my bust line. Then connected the dart all the way to that 1 inch above my top line. The next thing I did was to mark a quarter of my bust circumference right there on my bust line, starting before my zipper allowance line. So a quarter of my bust circumference is 9.5. Then my side seam allowance of 1 inch. Then on my waistline, I would measure a quarter of my waist circumference, 8 inches. Then add that 1 inch I took for my dart. Then add my side seam allowance of 1 inch. After that, on my top line, I would just go ahead and mark a quarter of my hip circumference plus 1 inch on my side seam allowance. Then the next thing is to just connect all the points together. I'll be contouring the back just like I did for the front. So taking away 2 inches from my shoulder measurement, I would mark 6 inches right there. And then the next thing I did was to also mark a quarter of my bust circumference plus half an inch And at that point, I took a dart of 0.25 inches on both lines. That is a total of ½ inches. And I just went ahead to just connect those points back into my original dart line. Then I would replace this ½ inch dart at this point. So I marked the ½ inch back. Then the next thing I did was to just create my armhole curve for the back. And the next thing to do is to create the back neckline. So I just placed my ruler like this and created the shape that I wanted. So roughly what I had there was 1 inch. So yours can be lower than that, or you can just leave the back neckline straight. So the next thing is to just cut out my back pattern like this. After cutting out the pattern, I used an arrow sign to indicate the areas where I would add ½ inch seam allowance. So the side seam already has its own allowance of 1 inch, so no need to add there anymore. And also my zipper allowance of 1 inch is already there. So for the hem allowance, I would add ½ inch just like I did for the front, and the back pattern is ready. So here are the materials I'll be working with. I have this beautiful African print fabric right here, and I also have a black velvet fabric and a black lining, and also I have this black organza that I'll be using for my sleeves. So I'll be cutting out the first part of my cups on the velvet, and the second and the third cup will be cut on my main fabric. Then I will be cutting my center front, my side front, my center back and my side back on my main fabric. Then whatever I cut on my main fabric, I would ensure that I cut the same thing on my lining. Then as for the sleeves, it will be towards the end of this tutorial that I would be showing you how I cut the sleeves. So I have gone ahead to cut out the main pieces that I need for the front, and I ensured to iron interfacing on all the pieces of the front. Then as for the cups, I also ironed interfacing on each of them, but I made sure to triple the interfacing so that I would have my cups so strong. So what I would be doing next is to place the center front and the side front together on the inner part, and I would sew them by the ½ inch seam allowance that I added there, and I would repeat the same thing on the other side. Place the side front to the center front and sew together by ½ inch. After doing that, I would also place the inner part of my second and third cups together and sew them by ½ inch. I would repeat the same thing on the other side. I'll be sewing the inner part of the two cups together by the ½ inch seam allowance that I added there. So the first part of the cup will be joined after I'm done joining the second and the third part. So for the back, I would also join the inner part of the center back and side back by ½ inch, and I would repeat the same thing on the other side. Then right here is the center back. There will be no need to join that part together. So here is the second and third cup joined together, and I made sure to trim off the excess seam allowance on the inside. So what I'll be doing is to place the first part of the cup onto the second and third part of the cup together like this, and from this edge I would sew by ½ inch till I get to this other side. So it's the same thing on the other one. Place the first part onto the second and third part like this, and I would sew by ½ inch till I get to this point right here. So I'm done joining the three parts of the corset cups together, and this is how the inner part looks like, looking relaxed and well ironed. So this is what the front piece looks like after joining them together. So I also went ahead to join the lining for the front together, and you can see how it looks like. So the next thing I did was to reshape my hemline. So I just folded the front piece into two like this, and then from the side of the hem I went upwards by 2 inches. Then I just reconnected that point back into the center front like this, and I went ahead to cut out the new shape for the hemline. So after cutting that of the main piece, I would be doing the same thing on the lining. So I folded the lining into two like this. So while doing this, they took the light. So I just ignored the fact that there was no light, and I went ahead to just place the front on the lining like so, and I went ahead to cut out the new shape for the hem of the lining. So after cutting, I have the new shape of the front looking like this, and I also have the lining looking exactly the same way like the main piece. So they finally brought back the light, and I went ahead to join the back piece together, and I have also reshaped the back hemline just like the front. So to reshape the back, what I did was to place the two back pieces together, and from the hem I came upwards by 2 inches and slanted it back into my center front. This is the piece that I cut out from the hem, so you can see the shape. So you can go ahead and reshape yours as you want. I have also joined the lining for the back, and I made sure to reshape the back hemline of the lining just like I did the main piece for the back. So you can see that the hem is the same. So to create the channel for my boning, I went ahead to iron interfacing on my velvet fabric. So the strips that I cut out were about 1.5 inches wide, but the length was unspecified. So to create the channel, starting from the center here, I would be sewing it like this. So from the top, I would sew all the way till I get to the hem. Then I would also create another channel right here where I have that seam line, and from my armhole down to the hem. So whatever I do on the side, I would do the same thing on the other side. Then for the back, I would create a channel right here where I have the joining, and on the other side too. Then I would also create another one close to my center back, and from my armhole down to the hem. And whatever I do here, I would repeat the same thing on the other side. So I'm done sewing the boning channel for the front, and this is that of the back. So the back has 3 on each part of the back. What I'll be doing next is to sew the corset cups into the front piece. So I would place them like this, and I would take this to my sewing machine and join them together by 1/2 inch. And here's the lining cups, and because I won't be using a bra cup, I made sure to pad the cup area of the lining so that it gives it that, round effect. So like the main piece, I would be joining the cups of the lining with the cup area of the lining. So I would place them like this and sew together by a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So I'm done joining the cups into the main piece of the front, and I've also done the same with the lining. What I did next was to place the lining and the main piece good side together, and I'm going to be sewing the neckline by 1/2 inch till I get to the other side. As for the back, what I'll be doing also is to place the lining onto the neckline of the main piece and sew together by 1/2 inch. So I would repeat the same thing on the other part of the back. So after sewing the neckline together, I made sure to give that area a good press so that it lays nice and flat. And I also went ahead to repeat the same thing for the back I press the neckline area so that it relaxes very well. Before inserting the boning, I measured how long my boning channel was, and it was 18 inches. So I took away 1 inch from that measurement. That would be 17 inches. So here is my boning. It is a plastic boning, and I went ahead to cut out the length of 17 inches. So after cutting, you can see that my boning is not relaxing. It is curved, and I don't want it to be curved. So I'm going to take this to my pressing iron. I'm going to press it so that it lays straight. So I'm done pressing the boning, and it is now straight. So the next thing to do is to just trim off the edges so that the boning is not sharp, so as not to poke me. After trimming, I passed it through my boning channel like this and pushed it till I got to the upper part of the corset. So after inserting the first boning, I would go ahead and repeat the same thing on all the remaining channels, and I would make sure to do the same thing for the boning channel on the back piece. So I'm done inserting all the bonings into each of the boning channel. The next thing I did was to place the lining towards the hemline of the main piece like this, and I'm going to be sewing the hem by 1/2 inch to this other side. As for the back, it's the same thing. Flip your lining over like this, match it up with the hem of your main fabric, and sew together by 1/2 inch. So I will just go ahead and repeat the same thing on the second part of the back. So I'm done sewing the hem of the lining and the main fabric together, and I made sure to give the hemline a good press so that it relaxes very well. I also did the same thing for the back. You can see that the hemline is looking very neat. So the next thing I'll be doing is to sew my zipper to the back of the corset. So this is my zipper. I will go ahead and sew it on my 1 inch zipper allowance. I've gone ahead to sew the zipper to the back. So the next thing to do now is to prepare the sleeves. So I have the length of my organza folded into 2. So the full length of an organza is usually 60 inches. So what I have on a fold is 30 inches. So the amount of fabric that I used was 26 inches. It wasn't up to a yard. So because I'll be needing 2 sleeves, what I did was to split this folded edge of my sleeve into 2. And the next thing I did was to create the elastic casing for the sleeve. So from the lower part of the fabric, I came upwards by 1.5 inches. So I marked that to the other end of the fabric, and also for the upper part of the sleeve, I'll also be creating an elastic casing. So I just marked 1.5 inches downwards like this. So I'm going to take this to my sewing machine, and I'm going to fold the 1.5 inch into 2, and I'm going to make a straight stitch right there at the edge. And I'll be doing the same thing at the lower part. I would fold the 1.5 inches into 2 like this and sew all the way to the other side. So whatever I do for the first sleeve, I will do the same thing on the second one. So I'm done creating the elastic casing for both the lower part and the upper part of the 2 sleeves. Now I'm going to be folding the upper part of the sleeve into 2 like this. So while doing this, I ensure that the edges of my fabrics are aligned and together. So to create the armhole, I just place the armhole area of my back piece like this, and I just use my chalk to trace the shape of the armhole curve at the edge of the fabric. Now the next thing to do is to cut out the armhole shape. Then the next thing you would need is your elastic. So I used the black elastic, and I went ahead to cut out an elastic that was about 8.5 inches long. After cutting out the first one, I used the first one to cut out a second one. So this 8.5 inches would be for the armhole area. Now for the lower part, I cut out an elastic that was about 9 inches long, and I used the first one to cut a second one. So I placed the 2 elastics at different positions. Now the next thing I used was my safety pin. So I used the safety pin and passed the elastic into the elastic casing like this. So when the elastic was a little bit inside, I just used my pin to hold the end so that I don't lose the elastic, and I continued to pass the elastic all the way till I got to the other end. So I have gotten to the other end, so I'll be making a stitch right here and right here to keep the elastic in place. So for the lower part of the sleeve, I'll be repeating the same thing with my safety pin. So I use my safety pin to pass the elastic into the elastic casing, and you can see that the black elastic complements the black organza. So I also use my pin to hold the end of the elastic at this point so that I don't lose it inside, and I continue to pass it all the way till I got to the other end of the elastic casing. So I'll be making a stitch on both ends of the elastic to keep the elastic in place. So whatever I do for the first sleeve, I would make sure to repeat the same thing on the second one. So I have the two sleeves ready now. So the next thing to do is to sew the armhole of the sleeve to the armhole of the corset. So to do that, I will place both armholes together and sew by 1/2 inch. So I would also be placing the armhole of the sleeve to the armhole of the back, and I would sew together by 1/2 inch. So for the other one, it's practically the same thing. I would sew the sleeves to the armhole of the corset by 1/2 inch. So I'm done attaching the sleeves to the armhole of the corset. So the next thing to do is to sew the side seams together. Placing them together by the right side, I would start by sewing from the side of the sleeve by 1 inch all the way to the hem. I would repeat the same thing on the other side. From the sleeve, I would sew by 1 inch down to the hem. So I'm done sewing the side seams together, and this is the finished work on the corset. If you have an overlocker, please don't forget to overlock the raw edges so you can have a clean and finished look. So after all is said and done, here is the final look of the corset. If you've enjoyed this video so far, please make sure you like, share, comment and subscribe to the channel, and I will see you all in my next video.